The history books tell you America and Britain were partners in World War II. They fought together. They won together. They built the post-war order together. The financial records tell a different story. While British soldiers held the line against Hitler, American bankers held a different line. Every clause of every aid agreement was engineered to transfer the infrastructure of global finance from London to New York. Lend-Lease was not charity. The Atlantic Charter was not idealism. Bretton Woods was not cooperation. These were the terms of surrender, signed before the war even ended. Britain entered the war as the global reserve currency. It exited as a debtor nation with a currency nobody wanted. This was not an accident of war. This was the war. Oil did not make America the financial superpower. Destroying the pound did. The British Empire did not collapse from military defeat. It was liquidated, asset by asset, through documented policy requirements that forced fire sales, banned currency controls, and mandated market openings. Congressional records show the terms. Bank of England archives quantify the damage. Treasury memoranda reveal the intent. The machinery of empire did not transfer through competition. It transferred through extraction. Welcome to Rashi Historical. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. The dollar rules your world today because of what happened to the pound in 1945. Every central bank holds dollars as reserves. Every oil transaction clears in dollars. Every debt crisis gets resolved in dollars. This dominance did not emerge from American productivity or innovation. It emerged from a deliberate campaign to destroy the previous system while its operator was too weak to resist. The blueprint written in 1945 still runs today. When America offers alliance, the terms are in the fine print. Britain controlled global finance in 1939 through three mechanisms. First, the sterling area. 40% of world trade settled in pounds. Every transaction between India and Australia, between Egypt and South Africa, between Malaysia and Britain cleared through London banks. You could not buy rubber from Malaya without pounds. You could not sell wheat from Canada without pounds. The pound was not a currency. It was the toll booth of global commerce. Second, imperial preference. Britain and its empire operated as a closed trading bloc with preferential tariffs. British goods entered India at lower rates than American goods. Australian wheat got better treatment in British markets than American wheat. The empire was a captive market of 500 million people locked into the sterling system. Third, the gold standard legacy. Even after Britain abandoned gold convertibility in 1931, decades of pound dominance meant central banks worldwide held reserves in sterling. The pound had institutional momentum. Banks trusted it because banks had always trusted it. This system generated enormous leverage. Britain imported more than it exported, running persistent trade deficits. But those deficits did not matter because trading partners accepted pounds as payment and held them as reserves. Britain paid for real goods with paper it printed. The reserve currency privilege let Britain live beyond its means. Then came September 1939. War spending exploded overnight. Britain needed American steel, American oil, American wheat, American munitions. But America sat outside the sterling area. American suppliers demanded payment in dollars or gold, not pounds. Britain faced a bottleneck. It needed American goods to fight Germany, but it lacked American currency to buy them. British gold reserves totaled $864 million in 1938, adequate for peacetime, desperately insufficient for total war. The initial solution was simple: sell British assets in America to raise dollars. British corporations owned substantial American holdings. Courtaulds operated viscose factories in Pennsylvania. Shell Oil had major American refining operations. British investors held railroad bonds, real estate, and equity stakes across American industries. These assets started hitting the market in 1940, but fire sales follow predictable patterns. Buyers know the seller is desperate. Prices collapse. British companies sold American holdings at 30 to 50% discounts to market value. The U.S. Treasury documented these transactions. They watched British financial strength drain into American hands at bargain prices. By mid-1940, the easy liquidations were complete. Britain had converted its accessible American assets to dollars and spent those dollars on weapons. The gold reserve was falling fast. Treasury projections showed Britain would hit $0 and zero gold by December 1940. Churchill faced a choice: stop buying American goods and lose the war, or find another financing mechanism. He chose to ask America for help. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to provide that help. He faced one obstacle. American law prohibited lending to nations that had defaulted on previous debts. Britain still owed America money from World War I. Congress was isolationist. Public opinion opposed European entanglement. Roosevelt found a workaround. Instead of loans, America would lend military equipment under a new framework. Britain would not pay during the war. Settlement would come later, under terms to be determined. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. The public presentation was simple. America becomes the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain with weapons to fight Hitler. Payment deferred until after victory. The actual terms were something else entirely. Section 3B of the Lend-Lease Act contained the kill shot. It required the president to ensure recipient nations were not accumulating dollar reserves while receiving aid. Read that again. Britain could not hold dollars while getting Lend-Lease support. The logic seemed reasonable on the surface. American taxpayers should not subsidize Britain while Britain hoarded American currency. If Britain had dollars, it should spend them before receiving free aid. The operational reality was devastation. Britain needed some dollar reserves to function. International transactions require working balances. A nation cannot operate with exactly zero foreign currency, but the law required near zero balances. Any accumulation triggered aid suspension. This created a systematic drain. Britain earned dollars from exports to America, limited war materials and goods. Those dollars had to be spent immediately on American purchases, or surrendered. Britain could not build reserves, it could not create a cushion. It existed hand to mouth, dependent on continuous American aid flows. The mechanism functioned as planned. U.S. National Archives records show Treasury officials monitored British dollar holdings weekly. When balances crept up, aid shipments slowed. When Britain proved it had spent everything, aid resumed. But the deeper mechanism was asset liquidation. If Britain earned any dollars from sources outside Lend-Lease, it had to prove it could not liquidate additional assets before receiving aid. This meant continuous forced sales of British holdings. American Vice Coast Corporation, the U.S. subsidiary of British-owned Courtaulds, was sold in 1941 for $54 million. Industry analysts valued it at $120 million. The sale was required to qualify for Lend-Lease. British-owned Shell Oil. American operations went to market in similar conditions. Distressed seller, patient buyers, massive discounts. The financial engineering was elegant. America provided Britain with weapons worth $31 billion over the war. But America also forced Britain to sell assets worth billions at fire sale prices, captured the liquidation value through American buyers, and prevented Britain from accumulating any dollar reserves that might provide post-war independence. Lend-Lease aid was real. The weapons arrived. They made military difference, but the aid terms systematically transferred British wealth to American hands while making Britain structurally dependent on American financing. The quid pro quo extended beyond immediate asset sales. Article 7 of the Mutual Aid Agreement, signed alongside Lend-Lease in 1942, contained the second trap. Article 7 committed Britain to eliminating discriminatory treatment in international commerce after the war. The language was vague. The meaning was specific. Dismantle imperial preference. State Department planning documents from 1942, preserved in Foreign Relations of the United States Archives, explicitly identify breaking the sterling trade bloc as a primary American objective. Officials described imperial preference as a barrier to American exports. They saw the war as an opportunity to force Britain to open empire markets. Churchill resisted. He understood what the Americans wanted. In a November 1942 speech, he declared he had not become prime minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, but his leverage was non-existent. Britain needed American weapons more than America needed British survival. The Americans waited. They knew time was on their side. Every month of war drained British strength and deepened dependence. By 1944, as Allied victory became certain, the Americans moved to the endgame. Bretton Woods happened in July 1944 before Germany surrendered. The outcome was predetermined. 44 nations sent delegates to the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire. They came to design the post-war monetary system. Two plans were on the table: the American plan designed by Harry Dexter White and the British plan designed by John Maynard Keynes. Keynes proposed an international clearing union with a synthetic reserve currency called Bancor. Nations would settle trade imbalances through this neutral unit rather than any single national currency. The system would spread adjustment burdens. Creditor nations would face pressure to rebalance, not just debtors. The Keynes plan would have prevented American reserve currency dominance. It would have created a multipolar system without a single financial hegemon. White proposed a dollar-based system with the International Monetary Fund managing exchange rates. Nations would hold dollars as reserves. Dollars would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. The system would run through American institutions, following American rules, denominated in American currency. The vote was never in doubt. America held the leverage. America had the gold, 70% of world monetary gold by 1944. America had the production capacity. America was the creditor. Britain held debt and declining reserves. British opinions were noted and ignored. The Bretton Woods Agreement established the dollar as the global reserve currency. Nations would peg their currencies to the dollar. The dollar would peg to gold. International trade would clear in dollars. Central banks would hold dollars. The infrastructure of reserve currency status transferred from London to New York through a vote at a hotel in New Hampshire. Keynes returned to London knowing he had failed. Bank of England internal memoranda from August 1944 show British officials understood the implications. Governor Montague Norman described the new system as ensuring American financial dominance for a generation. He was optimistic. The dominance has lasted 8 decades. But Bretton Woods was simply the public announcement of a transfer already completed. The real destruction happened in the forced liquidations, the blocked reserves, the imperial preference dismantling. By 1945, Britain was broke. Gold and dollar reserves had fallen to $453 million, down 48% from pre-war levels. External debts totaled $3.5 billion, money owed to sterling area countries for war supplies. Britain owed India alone over $1 billion for goods and troops. The empire had fought on credit, issuing pounds to colonies in exchange for real resources. Those pounds were now debts Britain had no ability to pay. Meanwhile, American reserves had grown to $26 billion. The war that bankrupted Britain had enriched America. Britain needed immediate post-war financing to avoid collapse. It had no leverage. The Americans knew it. John Maynard Keynes led the British negotiating team to Washington in September 1945. He came asking for a $6 billion grant to help Britain recover from the war. He was not naive. He knew America would refuse a grant. But he opened with that request to establish a negotiating position. He hoped to secure a $5 billion loan at nominal interest with generous repayment terms. The Americans offered $375 billion at 2% interest, with repayment starting in 1951. The amount was insufficient. Britain needed at least $5 billion to cover the gap between imports and exports during Reconstruction. But the loan amount was not the weapon. The conditions were the weapon. Condition 1, sterling convertibility. Britain had to make the pound convertible for current account transactions within 1 year of the loan. This meant anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars at the official rate. British Treasury officials warned this would trigger a run on the pound. The sterling area held $3.5 billion in pound balances. If those holders could convert to dollars, they would. Dollars were backed by gold and American productivity. Pounds were backed by a bankrupt empire. The British negotiators explained this to their American counterparts. Treasury records document the exchange. The Americans insisted on convertibility. They framed it as promoting free markets and multilateral trade. The real purpose was destroying the sterling area. As long as pounds were not convertible, the sterling area countries had to hold and use their pounds within the sterling zone. This captive demand supported the pound and kept the trade bloc intact. Convertibility would end that captivity. British economists calculated that convertibility would drain reserves within months. American economists knew this too. State Department memoranda show officials understood convertibility would break the sterling system. They required it for exactly that reason. Condition 2, imperial preference dismantling. Britain had to begin eliminating preferential tariffs within the empire. The loan agreement required Britain to support American proposals for trade liberalization, which meant opening empire markets to American goods on equal terms. This broke the closed imperial trading system. American exports could now compete in India, Africa, Australia, and Canada on the same terms as British exports. Condition 3, Lend-Lease settlement. Britain had to settle outstanding Lend-Lease obligations. America valued British countersupplies to American forces during the war at $650 million. America valued Lend-Lease aid at $31 billion. The settlement required Britain to pay $650 million for American military equipment in Britain at war's end, while receiving credit for its countersupplies. The net cost to Britain, $0, but an obligation to buy surplus American military equipment it did not need. The British cabinet debated rejecting the loan. Chancellor of the Exchequer Hugh Dalton called the terms an economic Munich. The conditions would accelerate British decline rather than enable recovery. But Britain had no alternative. Without the loan, the country would default on debts, face immediate austerity, and lose any remaining international credibility. Parliament approved the loan in December 1945 by a vote of 343 to 100. The opposition came from both left and right. Socialists opposed surrendering economic sovereignty. Conservatives opposed dismantling the empire. The center voted yes because there was no choice. America had structured the options perfectly. Britain could accept subordination or face collapse. Either outcome served American interests. The loan took effect in July 1946. The convertibility requirement began counting down. Britain made the pound convertible on July 15, 1947, exactly 1 year after the loan as required. The run started immediately. Sterling area countries rushed to convert pound balances to dollars. Egypt wanted dollars to buy American goods. India needed dollars to pay for Reconstruction imports. Australia sought to diversify reserves away from a weakening currency. The mechanics were simple. A country holding pounds would present them to the Bank of England and demand dollars at the official exchange rate of 4.03 per pound. Britain had to provide the dollars. Its dollar reserves drained at a rate of $100 million per week. Britain started convertibility with approximately $2.5 billion in dollar reserves, including the American loan. At $100 million per week, the reserves would last 6 months. But the drain accelerated as holders realized Britain was running out. The rate hit $150 million per week by early August. In 6 weeks, Britain lost $700 million in reserves. 28% of its total dollar holdings vanished. Chancellor Hugh Dalton suspended convertibility on August 20th, 1947. Britain had lasted 5 weeks under the requirement. The Americans expressed disappointment. The loan agreement required convertibility. Suspension was a violation. But the damage was permanent. The convertibility crisis proved to the world that the pound was not a reliable reserve currency. Central banks began shifting reserves to dollars. Trade invoicing moved to dollars. The sterling area continued in weakened form, but the psychological break was complete. The pound would never recover reserve status. The 1967 devaluation and 1976 IMF crisis were simply confirmations of a death that occurred in August 1947. The American loan, presented as assistance, had functioned as a guillotine. Britain took the money, met the conditions, and destroyed its own currency system in the process. By 1950, the transition was complete. The infrastructure of global finance had moved from London to New York across every dimension. Reserve holdings, central banks shifted from 60% pound reserves in 1939 to 60% dollar reserves by 1950. The composition reversed in a decade. Trade, invoicing, dollar-denominated trade rose from 30% of global transactions in 1939 to 55% by 1950. Pound-denominated trade fell from 50% to 25%. Capital markets. New York replaced London as the source of international lending. The World Bank and IMF, headquartered in Washington, directed reconstruction finance. The Marshall Plan distributed dollars, not pounds, to rebuild Europe. Gold flows. American gold reserves peaked at $24.6 billion in 1949, representing 70% of world monetary gold. Britain held $1.4 billion. The gold concentration gave the dollar unmatched credibility. Institutional power. The IMF, World Bank, and GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, all operated under American leadership with rules designed to benefit dollar dominance and open markets to American exports. The British Empire did not collapse from military defeat. Britain was on the winning side of World War II. The empire collapsed from financial extraction, disguised as alliance. The numbers show the transfer. British gold and dollar reserves fell from 864 million in 1938 to 453 million in 1945 to 380 million by 1947. American reserves rose from 12.8 billion in 1938 to 26 billion in 1945 to 24.6 billion in 1949. The decline from the peak reflected gold flowing to Europe through Marshall Plan aid, further cementing dollar dominance. British external debt rose from nearly zero in 1938 to 3.5 billion in 1945. American external assets rose from $11 billion to $17 billion in the same period. The war inverted the creditor-debtor relationship. Britain entered World War II as the global financial hegemon. It exited as a client state of the American financial system. This was not an accidental outcome of war expenses. Japan and Germany spent themselves into destruction too, but they were enemies. Britain was the ally that got liquidated. The mechanism was policy, not markets. Lend-Lease terms forced asset sales. Article 7 forced imperial preference dismantling. Bretton Woods institutionalized dollar dominance. The 1945 loan forced convertibility. Each step was designed to transfer wealth and infrastructure from British to American control. British officials saw it happening. Governor Montague Norman's correspondence describes financial servitude. Chancellor Hugh Dalton called the loan terms an economic Munich. Keynes knew the Bretton Woods vote destroyed any hope of multipolar finance. But Britain had no leverage to resist. The Americans held the bottleneck, access to dollars and goods Britain needed to survive. The price of that access was subordination. The template established in the 1940s continues today. When America provides alliance or assistance, the terms serve American structural interests. Lend-Lease is now IMF conditionality. Article 7 is now bilateral trade agreements requiring market opening. Bretton Woods is now dollar-denominated debt that forces countries to earn dollars through exports. The specific mechanisms evolve. The underlying pattern remains: assistance creates dependence. Dependence creates leverage. Leverage extracts concessions. Concessions transfer wealth and power. Modern parallels appear everywhere. European allies complain about American demands regarding China trade, defense spending, and technology policy. The complaints mirror British frustration in the 1940s. The difference is, Europeans learned the lesson. Do not become so dependent on American support that you lose the ability to refuse American terms. The dollar's reserve status today traces directly to 1945. Every central bank holding dollar reserves, every oil contract priced in dollars, every international debt denominated in dollars exists because the pound was systematically destroyed when its operator was too weak to defend it. Britain's weakness in 1945 was understandable. The country had fought total war for 6 years, but the response to that weakness was not partnership. It was extraction. America offered Britain a choice: accept subordination or face collapse. The choice was designed so that both options served American interests. If Britain accepted the terms, the dollar would rise. If Britain rejected the terms and collapsed, the dollar would rise from British failure. The outcome was predetermined. The method was documented. The records are public. Your history teacher told you America and Britain were partners who built the post-war order together. The financial archives tell you America was the predator and Britain was the prey. The partnership was real only in the sense that a parasite partners with its host. The British pound died in 1947. The death certificate was signed in 1945. The murder weapon was Lend-Lease, Article 7, Bretton Woods, and the loan agreement. The killer was America. And the motive was the same motive behind every financial crime: transfer of wealth from the weak to the strong, executed when the victim has no ability to resist. The dollar rules the world today because America broke the pound when Britain was too desperate to fight back. That is not speculation. That is documented history. This is Rashi historical. We follow the money. And the money trail from 1945 leads directly to every dollar in your wallet, every treasury bond in central bank reserves, and every oil transaction priced in American currency. The infrastructure of empire does not transfer through competition. It transfers through extraction. And extraction requires leverage. America got its leverage in 1941. It used that leverage from 1942 to 1947. By 1950, the transfer was complete. The British pound is the ghost that haunts every reserve currency. Today, China watches. Europe watches. They see the American debt levels rising, the political dysfunction spreading, the overreach accumulating. They remember what happened to the last reserve currency when its operator lost control. The question is whether America learned the lesson it taught Britain. Power sustained through extraction eventually exhausts the victim. And when the victim is exhausted, the extractor loses the source of its wealth. The dollar dominance built in 1945 faces pressures in 2025. BRICS nations discuss alternative payment systems. Central banks diversify reserves toward gold and euros and yuan. The dollar's share of global reserves has declined from 85% in 1977 to 58% today. The decline is slow. The dollar remains dominant, but the pattern is visible. Every reserve currency eventually falls when its operator overextends, accumulates too much debt, and uses financial leverage as a weapon. Britain learned this between 1914 and 1947. America may be learning it now. The machinery of empire does not last forever. It transfers to the next operator willing to build it and ruthless enough to take it. In 1945, that operator was America. The victim was Britain. The method was documented policy disguised as alliance. The next transfer is coming. The only question is who will be ruthless enough to execute it, and whether America will see it coming the way Britain did not. This is the history they did not teach you. This is the money trail they kept hidden. This is Rashi historical.